We'll go ahead and get started. It is 8 after 9, and I'll call the Committee on Affordability, Accountability, and Planning to order. I'd like to welcome everyone in attendance. We appreciate you being here today. Please be advised that the meeting is being broadcast over the Internet, and I am going to, right off the bat, recognize Chairman Hahn for an appointment to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm temporarily appointing Janelle Shepard to the Committee on Affordability, Accountability, and Planning. Once the governor appoints our new board members, I will examine all committee appointments and make any necessary changes as needed. And members, I just want to tell you I appreciate all of your commitment and help in a time when we're short 3 board members, and hopefully that will be alleviated after the first of the year. So, Janelle, thank you very much for filling in.
All right, moving on then. Now that we have Janelle assigned with us, we'll go to agenda item number 2. Is consideration or approval of the minutes from the September 25th, 2013 meeting on the committee meeting. Questions or discussion?
Move approval.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you very much. Agenda item 3 is consideration of approval of the consent calendar. Is there any discussion? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that there was comment received on only items 6, 7, and 18. Staff has made a response. I would like to discuss those. However, items 1, 2, 11, 15, 19, 20, and 22 had no comment. There was no discussion. I understand those fully and concur with those recommendations. So I would move that we have the consent calendar adopted as published with the addition of 1, 2, 11, 15, 19, 20, and 22, unless staff has need to discuss.
And did we?
No, which means I will move that items 1, 2, 11, 15, 19, 20, and 22 be added to the consent calendar and it be adopted.
Need a second?
Second.
All in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you, Dr. Tesher. Agenda item number 4.
Mr. Chairman,
yes, sir.
Mine was showing that 15 and 22 had been withdrawn. Is that correct?
Oh.
Yes.
So they can't.
So
Then they can't
if
go to
that
the
being the
consent
case,
agenda.
then
Consent.
we would not
They were
want them on the
withdrawn.
consent agenda.
Yeah, it just needs to be noted that they can't be adopted. So I think the chair just makes that.
Yeah, so Susan will make sure that the record reflects that those were withdrawn, so they
Correct.
won't be on the consent agenda, and they've been withdrawn. Good catch. Agenda item number 4 is public testimony on items relating to the Committee on Affordability, Accountability, and Planning. We don't have anyone registered to testify, and to my knowledge, that is what we have at the moment. So we'll move on to the next item, which is item 5A, which is a report on facility projects that were submitted to the coordinating board. You'll notice that there have been very few submitted this quarter. Susan Brown, the Assistant Commissioner, Planning and Accountability, is available for questions.
Part of the reason that we don't think we're having very many is because a lot of institutions were, I think, somewhat planning on having TRBs. They did not pass, so I think they're going back and trying to rethink how to pay for some of these buildings at this point.
So when do we expect that there'll be a rush of others?
I don't have a clue.
Whenever we have TRBs.
Yeah.
Whenever we have TRBs,
Whenever that happens.
it may be the best.
Why should we even be, I don't think, excuse me, why should we even be addressing that because of the recent change in the legislature? I'm sorry. Why is that an issue for us when we're not charged with approving those new projects anymore? I was just asking.
Actually, we are charged with it. We still are obligated to review those projects, Dennis.
Okay.
And then and Susan can probably provide better clarification, but subsequently, then we report to the regents.
Okay.
If the regents subsequently approve a project that we indicate do not meet those requirements, then they have to report that in their LAR. Is that correct?
Well, we have, actually, the Board of Regents already, they can send it to us before or after the Board of Regents approves it. So then we review it, but if they do not meet our standards, then we send information to the LBB and the governor's office on those that do not meet standards.
So to that point, Susan, we'll still be doing what we've always done.
Correct.
The work part of that
Work
will
part has
still be
not
being
changed.
done, and the information disseminated, we just
And we
won't-
still set.
they'll still do what they
we still
choose to do.
We still set the standards. We get that information on the square footage and all that. We still get their inventories and make sure that is correct. We still do the facilities audits to make sure that what they're submitting is correct to us. All of that stayed the same.
Could I ask another question while I'm on this issue? Do we have the authority or statutory authority to change those standards? Are those standards in stone? In other words, as time goes on, I'm just getting clarification. Do we have as a board, do we have the ability at times to modify those standards?
We are actually at the point of requesting nominations for a negotiated rulemaking because of all the changes to the facility. So we're going to be having a negotiated rulemaking with the institutions on the standards and how all of this is going to work. And right now it's strictly a formula based on costs and that sort of thing. And so we have that option then in negotiated rulemaking to work with the institutions to develop those standards. So they can be changed, but we have to go through the negotiated rulemaking process.
And so that process is underway, or
It's underway. The letter just went out asking for nominations.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like, if it's agreeable to you all and Chairman Hans, that we have perhaps some clear guidelines so we can know what we're responsible for with regard to the changes that the legislature made. I think the board is very willing, and I know I am as an individual board member, to comply. I just want a clear understanding of what our responsibilities are and how we go about that process, because it's a new thing for even some of the older board members. And if we could perhaps get that in writing sometime, where we could have it and from time to time review it, then I think that would eliminate any confusion or maybe some unnecessary time that we could spend on things that we really shouldn't have to be spending time on that if we really don't understand it. Thank you.
Susan, as I understand it, we still don't have information on deferred maintenance.
No.
And
They actually do deferred maintenance, and they have to report it to each of their board of regents. They don't report it to us. We have asked them for a copy, and we actually, because we set the format, we kept the same format. We have had, I think, 10 or 11 institutions that actually went ahead and sent all their information to us and had us summarize it because we already had the programs written, and then we sent it back to them for them to present to their board, just because it was easier on them, and we were glad to help out.
okay.
So we will be getting the summary level for everybody, but the detail we received for 10 or 11 of the institutions.
Is that information that we have, is it reported to the LBB or?
It's only reported, statutorily, it's only reported to their Board of Regents. However, we can compile all the summaries and provide it to the legislature if we would like.
I would like that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point, and kind of like Dennis is talking about, what are we going to do with it? Where's our role? And kind of how do we have agreement that that's what we would like to do?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure that whatever we're responsible for, that we do our jobs.
Right.
And if I'm still not clear in my mind exactly, the appropriate questions to ask, what not to ask, and I'm all for asking questions and having some level of accountability. I just need to know what we're clearly responsible for now, so we won't just keep beating a dead horse. Thank you.
David?
So, Susan, I accept your premise is most logical that the TRB's lack of passage may be why there's a gap, but the alternative theory to that may be that because of the legislation that passed, that they do not have to prospectively come to us for an approval that there may be some of these that are in process at the board levels that are planning on reporting to us after they've approved it.
That could be true.
And so that's one of the nuances. It's very different, Dennis. The other is that really our responsibilities is purely oversight and reporting. We have no approval, and so it's a much more staff-driven process. And the other that's going to be different is what Susan was talking about is negotiated rulemaking. So the rules before were made by this board with staff input. The rules in the future will be negotiated between the institutions and this board and the staff that represents it.
Well, that's true. However, I would add that even when we bring rules forward in the past, we always tried to work with institutions anyway to get feedback from the institutions. And then, of course, we have the 30-day comment period where they can supply all sorts of comments. So it is a big change in one way that we have all of that before we even post the rules, but it's not like we didn't work with the institutions
Begin with.
No, and I don't mean to imply that. I think particularly we have been in negotiated rulemaking all along, and it's been my experience, and I think that our staff has been wonderful at responding to recommendations from public comment. However, at the end of the day, the decision was ours and ours alone in the past. In the future, it's going to be a mutual decision making.
It is.
And I think that's going to be the big difference. So our duty is to oversee the staff who holds things according to the standard, whether they've already passed or not passed, reports that to the boards if they have not passed, and then ultimately reports that to the LBB, my understanding,
We send it to the
regardless
LBB
of whether they adopt it or not. At the end, that it did meet the standard, it didn't meet the standard, and the new standards will be adopted with mutual rulemaking.
Right.
So are we anticipating a lot of changes in the new standards? I mean,
Not in the new standards per se. Those have been very formula driven,
Right.
based on the costs that have been reported to us or the actual cost as a building is completed. We use that information to set the cost standards. So I don't really think there would be a big change in the standards or the way they're calculated.
Wasn't there one change in the standards recommended by the chancellor at the University of North Texas that will be considered?
I haven't seen a standard change from him.
I thought it had to do with, well, we'll discuss it. I thought he brought it up at one of the meetings here. We need to look back.
Okay.
Harold?
Just for clarification purposes, as far as negotiated rulemaking, what happens at the end of the day if there's no agreement?
Pistol's at 20 paces.
So we'd
I'm
arm
not a very
wrestle.
good shot. That wouldn't be a good thing.
That would be. You're on our side.
Good morning, Bill.
Good morning. I presume by the question that you mean if there's no agreement coming out of the negotiated
Right.
rulemaking.
That's correct.
Then it is up to the agency whether or not to go forward with rules. In this case, we're directed to have these rules in place. So the answer would be we would go forward with rules. My guess is that a rule would be put together by staff, submitted to the board for approval, just as in the past, prior to this change, and then it's up to the board whether or not to adopt, reject, modify, et cetera.
Does that clarify? Okay. Thank you, Bill.
All right, let's move on to agenda item 5B, which is a discussion of recommendations for membership of the Higher Education Strategic Planning Committee. Dr. David Gardner, the Deputy Commissioner of Academic Planning and Policy Chief Academic Officer, will provide an overview. David?
Thank you, and Susan will help on this as well. Let me begin by saying that in light of what we were just discussing, there are a number of things that have changed at the board, and we realized sort of late to the process that we had to develop rules for a strategic planning committee. So those have been developed, and they'll go to the agency operations committee in January. So, but we do know that they followed the discussions we've had thus far in terms of the basic composition of the committee and how that would be structured. There's still room for you to make some decisions, say in the next month in terms of some variations for how the committee will be handled. But with that in mind, just wanted to let you know that the committee can be up to 24 members. And as we've discussed before, we're talking about former members of boards of regents and trustees, former presidents and chancellors, probably a couple of K-12 leaders, and some business leaders. We learned from the Closing Gaps process that it was very helpful to have people that were familiar with higher education, but they did not have a current interest in a particular institution. It's not to say that they wouldn't be aware of it, but they didn't feel they had to represent that institution in those discussions, but they were knowledgeable. Now, knowing this, I sent out a memo late Monday afternoon to the various systems requesting nominations, given these conditions. And the interesting thing is, Susan tells me we've received 3 nominations for existing presidents, so we're going to have to work on the former aspect of it. But the idea is...
Did you grade those papers an F for failure to read the instructions?
Susan was going to contact
I will be very nice about how I...
Yes.
Please be tactful.
Or maybe by the time they get on the committee, they are former.
Maybe they're foretelling something.
Well, on a positive note, they knew this was important enough that they got in nominations right away and wanted to participate. Our External Relations Office is going to contact and has already talked to the chambers and sent out pretty much the same memo to chambers asking for nominations for business leaders. I know that the Business Council has had contact already. We'll probably identify the K-12 leaders ourselves, just given our experiences with that. So we're encouraged by that now. That the plan is we'll receive those nominations, but they still have to be appointed by the board. So we're requesting these by the 10th. The plan is when we get these is to meet before the board meeting with the chair and vice chair of the board to discuss possible nominations. When they've reached some decisions who they think would be a good group, to send out a preliminary letter saying, we're hoping you'll consider participating. The meeting would start at the end of February, the first meeting. But this is contingent upon board approval. So you would need to consider these names at the January meeting. And, of course, as soon as the chair and the vice chair identify folks I think would be appropriate, would share those with you at the same time. So you'd have plenty of notice on those. But that's a way to get it started and going. You still have some opportunity to tweak some things before then, but we knew it was important if we're going to get started that soon to move ahead. So we wanted to let you know about that. So the next part of the discussion is, we recently had our governing board conference, and one of the major themes of this was to discuss going forward in the future. Now, at that meeting, Mr. Jenkins shared with the group, and I have to say, you'd think he had been doing planning for about 23 years.
I was coached well.
It was very good. When we had our discussion groups later, everybody understood what had been said, and I have to say I need to take some lessons from you in terms of the presentation. But it went well. They understood. So we had discussion groups with all the participants at the conference following Mr. Jenkins' presentation. So we went into the groups, and I have to say each of the groups took a little different form. We had 3 questions they all addressed, and then they diverged, as you might expect, in different directions. We're going to give you some highlights because we promised those folks we would share those things with you. Some of them will be expected. Some are things we hadn't thought about, and so I think that will be interesting to see. We'll go through these quickly. Yes, sir.
And when are we going to receive those?
You actually have them in your PowerPoints. They're all listed. You should have right there that.
This part?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the breakdown of what the breakout groups had are all within here?
It's all summarized there. And we have much more detail if you'd like to see that at some point, because we had minutes taken from.
Are we going to have a discussion on some of this at tomorrow's board retreat?
We can discuss any of it you want to tomorrow.
Okay.
We've got, I think, an
helpful.
hour and a half scheduled for strategic planning discussion.
Yeah.
So we just wanted to, have in a public forum, let people know what we had heard and that we were listening. But there's opportunity to
And that was one of the main messages we were trying to deliver at the leadership conference, and I think people were appreciative of it. I've received some positive feedback that they appreciate that opportunity, and so I think that they really went into these breakout sessions with the thought of coming up with some good constructive input.
Okay. So I'll just go through the first three questions, and you'll see later they diverged into talking specifically about the wave in one group, particularly Susan's, and she may want to weigh in on that group. But the first question really addressed how do you think we should develop consensus on the goals and securing feedback on the targets? I don't think there was anything that you wouldn't have anticipated here. They, of course, want people to keep informed. They suggested having things like stakeholder meetings, a monthly newsletter. We hadn't considered that in particular, but there's something we could distribute following each meeting of the planning committee to keep people up to date on what's going on. That we ought to organize some focus groups to solicit input. Now, the last time, so you'll know, aside from the planning committee, the committee decided that we needed a small number of task forces which actually had people from institutions to discuss specific topics the planning committee was interested in. So in a sense, those held focus groups. So I think this is something that you and the board can decide if you want something more specialized once you get a little bit more into the planning process to solicit feedback and create a structured avenue for feedback. That had been brought up in the council earlier, that we could use social media in some ways that might be helpful. Or we have our college commonplace website that we haven't used yet, where we could solicit feedback. So we'll be looking at that. They brought up something that was interesting. They said use common definitions and language. They were really making the point that the different sectors can use certain words different ways, and that we need to assure that where possible, we use words that communicates with each sector well, and also the public and the business community. To make, we're using definitions, try to use things that are common. So, for example, years ago when we started talking about graduation rates, we realized that we talked about retention is a good thing in higher education, meaning students stayed in. When we talked to the public school sector, retention meant they weren't passing. So that's when, if you wonder why we use the word persistence, we use the word persistence because that communicates with both sectors. So there are some things that, as you go through these, you learn, and so I thought it was interesting that the folks participating understood that. They talked about reaching out to parents. We had not done something like that directly before. We need to think about how to do that. It probably makes sense to at least have something along those lines. And then, of course, to have a broad and diverse representation of stakeholders. This board's always been very good about that, and those that were participating and were familiar knew that we always make an effort to represent regions and various groups on the committee. The next question was defining partnerships between the state and its higher education institutions. Who are the stakeholders? Get staff and faculty buy-in to keep on track. That's a challenging aspect, I can tell you, in terms of getting down to all those thousands and thousands and thousands of people at institutions. Last time we did make an effort to communicate directly with the faculty senates, which we don't do on everything, but we found that was helpful and got some feedback from them. And of course, things you always want us to do to communicate with legislative committees, and of course secure institutional and public feedback. That I think that's something we do naturally, and we're emphasizing even further now. In terms of, they were asked if there were changes to the potential timeline. One thing they mentioned, which we had never talked about, but we did do with closing the gaps, I was glad they brought up, was that we ought to have 5-year increments. So that, as with closing the gaps, we have these points where we're systematically making sure we're making progress and can revisit the plan if we need to make any adjustments. They made the point, just as a reminder, that there's certain times of the year that aren't really good for feedback from the institutions, and we need to bear that in mind. Don't use the name beyond closing the gaps. I think some of you had discussed that already. I think it's going to be a challenge to come up with a new name for a plan that catches hold the way Closing the Gaps did. You may not be aware, but there are many Closing the Gaps plans around the country that came after this plan. So you guys actually set a trend, and with just that name. They talked about giving them a chance to provide feedback at the annual conference. That makes a lot of sense. So it would mean, this time next year we should have made a lot of progress, and it will be a good chance with lots of people in the room to get that feedback. That was very helpful. And they talked about initiating a campaign similar to the GO campaign or Gentex at the beginning of the plan, really about college participation. I will say in the group, I don't think we have it listed here, that I was in, early on they made the point that they didn't see anything in the wave about demographics in the population, and that while we made a lot of progress, we shouldn't forget that and to keep that in mind. And I think it's, to some extent, one group was getting at that. With that, we still have a lot of changes in the demography going forward over the years. The wave discussions, you'll recall in the wave, one of the goals identified in that was alignment with the workforce. And they brought up some questions that were very good. I know Susan and I had talked about some of these beforehand. There are a lot of things that you still have to define, and they instinctively identified some of these. So what really makes a field relevant, for example? These are things that as we go forward with the committee, it reminds us we have to start finding some answers to provide the committee, and then they can make decisions, but to provide them with that feedback. So will some fields be deemed irrelevant, or at least not as important? What does it mean to the fine arts and liberal arts? How do they talk about rephrasing the word improve graduation rates in relevant fields. We knew that we had some problem with that wording already, but that's a reminder. And then aligning the workforce with education needs. Do their majors lead to gainful employment? Part of what they're talking about is, and this is a shortcoming that every state has at this point, is understanding directly whether we can know whether someone's employed, at least if they're employed in Texas, but we don't know if they're really employed in the field that got related to the degree they got their field in. So they could go to, someone, for example, could get a degree in accounting and come to work for the coordinating board. You know they came to work for this government organization, but you wouldn't know if they're working here as an accountant. I would assume that we probably wouldn't have hired them if that weren't to benefit in some way, even though they weren't directly working in it. But as an accountant, but you don't know. Next, they were talking about alignment, and I think they emphasized that something we all know, and I think we heard a lot. I was talking to Dr. Golden earlier about what they were finding out from their regional task forces, that transfer is still a dominant concern in the field, and frankly it is with our staff, and we need to that's the most important aspect of alignment. How can you have a state which has many systems function more like a system, even though they're different systems, and work better together? And I can tell you internally the staff is already working. We've got a number of separate efforts that we haven't clustered as a coherent program, and we need to do a better job of that. But they're going to want to discuss that quite a lot. They talked about the Common Course numbering system, which went to the legislature, didn't pass as a requirement for universities to implement. They thought that was an important thing to do. That we need to improve the process of reverse transfer.
David, could I just ask a question about that? Do we know why that didn't pass? I mean, were the institutions not on board with that, or?
It would require all of not all, probably the majority of the public universities to change all of their numbering systems, which they have their numbering systems aligned from freshmen all the way through, graduate programs. And it would require them to change all their numbering systems and their syntax. That's not a cheap thing to do. So I think it probably had to deal with that. They do have crosswalks. I'm not sure that those crosswalks are as visible as maybe they could be, so that the students are still having a hard time trying to figure out some of the things. I can relate to that a little bit better now.
So it's a money issue?
I think that could be part of it, and it would it's going to require a lot of change on their end as far as how their numbering systems and computer systems, and some of them have 3 digits, some have 4 digits, and you've just got a lot of programming issues that might be playing into that. And that's just a speculation on my part, but I know that's one of the concerns I have heard from institutions. I don't know how widespread that concern is.
And that's a legitimate issue. I think it's one of those things. If it's would be an important thing to do, but if done, I think institutions probably would need to be given a few years to do it in a systematic way so that it didn't result in some of the problems that happen when you create or modify computer systems. We're familiar with some of those issues lately nationally. So this is a dramatic, and institutions have thousands of courses. And so the opportunity is, when you have somebody, you still need a human to interface at some point, and every time you change something, there's a possibility of an error. But it's very challenging right now, even though there are crosswalks, for a student to be aware of all those, or an advisor at a community college to know if a student's considering, say, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and University of Houston, to be aware of all those crosswalks, or to be facile with all those crosswalks. And so that's what they're hitting at. I should say people may not realize that the common course numbering system that's in place is voluntary, and institutions did create this on their own a number of years ago. Staff here worked with them some, but it was primarily an institutional effort to create the common course system we have. So I think there's a historical belief in the importance of it. That the issue is getting everybody to use the same numbers at the same time.
David, did you have something?
Yeah.
So you're sort of dabbling around answering the question, have we proven that it works and that it's effective, that it does what it's intended to do? Is there a model out there where it's been adopted and it's working? That would be my question on this. I understand the rationale, but unless you can show a definitive benefit, that's an awful big expense, and you've got a lot of institutional opposition to having to adopt something different with these digital numbering systems. It's almost like converting to a foreign language. And I'm experiencing the same thing in medicine because we're having to adopt a brand new digital language that's being shoved down our throat by the federal government. But I don't have an opinion on that.
I don't know that we have proof. Because I don't think we have any universities that I'm aware of that have fully adopted that. So, if you saw it being easier for one school who had adopted it versus, students complaining more about a school that hadn't adopted it, you would have something to go with. I don't really have any data. I know having.
But are there other states possibly that have done this? Have we looked?
I haven't looked recently, so we can go out and look recently.
Yeah.
I know when it was first adopted, all the community colleges adopted it, and that was good. At the time, which this is years ago, there hadn't been any other states that had done it, but I don't believe we have looked recently, but I can check on that.
Discussion is an example of the type of discussion that the planning committee has to have, because these are simply things that people brought up at these meetings, and frankly, if we take the approach that we've been talking about with the plan, mostly it will be measurable goals, 4 or 5 at the high level, then we'll have some sub-goals, and then there will be a number of strategies, but key strategies. And so one would say, how many key strategies does the state really want to implement versus institutions finding ways to achieve the goals on their own? Because one of the principles in the past was, let's identify important statewide strategies, and then let's empower institutions to find a way to achieve the goals and hold them accountable for achieving the goals, but not tell them exactly how to do that. So we know that our improvement in graduates, for example, hasn't been addressed in an identical way at all the institutions. We have seen a dramatic improvement, even though we still have, much way to go. So as I mention each of these things, bear in mind, we need to have exactly this type of discussion. We need to have evidence because this involves cost and it's a lot of change. If we have examples of where it works, we need to know, and it has to be examined closely because there is a cost inherent in it. So, and of course, the board will be able to discuss anything the committee recommends.
Dennis?
I want to make just a brief and pointed comment. This issue's been around a long time, I mean, I've been involved in higher education nearly 3 decades now, and we've been kicking this thing around all over the place for the last 30 years. I think it's a bigger problem. You know, as we all know, over half of our students enrolled in higher educations in the community colleges, and I think the biggest problem we see is getting the community colleges numbering system in such a way that it will correspond and to vertically transfer into the senior institutions. And quite frankly, I'm seeing more and more pushback from the senior institutions that want to question the rigor of the community college courses. So, you know, as we engaged the community colleges this past year statewide, we made sure that they were aware that that was an issue, and we weren't trying to be judgmental, but part of our goal is to coordinate that transfer in a meaningful and positive way. Now, of course, the community colleges are going to come back and say there is rigor in our courses, but we see a number of four-year institutions now that are raising their entrance requirements for transfer students to even be admitted into their institutions. At one time, a student with a C average could transfer into the University of Houston. They can't do that anymore with coming from a community college, and there's multiple reasons for that. Part of it is to try to improve their graduation rates by improving the quality of the students in their institutions. But there are some instances where I think there's some legitimate concerns that they have that when a student comes to that four-year institution, that they are prepared, just as they should be prepared when they enter the community colleges from high school. So each step of that way, that student needs to be vertically integrated in a manner in which that produces student success. And they're beginning to see some of the institutions, particularly a lot of the Tier 1 institutions, seeing that the community college students are just not performing as well as they should. And I hate to say that, being a community college person. You'd think I'd be the last person that would say that. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just saying that's a perception. Whether it's true or not, we have to deal with it. I don't think this issue will ever be solved in Texas, personally.
Well,
I think it's worth solving because it's very important.
Right.
But whether it happens or not, I think there's too many stakeholders that are going to say my institution is better than that institution, therefore my course is better than that course, and your course doesn't equal my course, and it's just a big old squabble. I say let's address it, but let's don't spend a lot of political capital in trying to fix it, because I don't think we're going to fix it.
Well, and this probably isn't really supposed to be in this committee discussion right here, but I'm hearing still from a lot of parents who say even within systems, you have the UT system that won't accept a kid from another UT system school for nursing and things like that. Maybe they did their undergrad here and want to go ahead and complete their bachelor's, and yet they'll accept somebody from somewhere else, but then say you don't have the right courses to go on into. It's just ridiculous. So just adding my opinion there.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing that we learned with the tuning process, and the faculty brought it up themselves, is that it's not just vertical alignment but horizontal alignment.
Oh, yeah.
And nursing is a particular area, and we have some things undergoing where we hope will address that. But there are clearly, between universities and between community colleges and between the two, just at the lower division level alone. So we need to remember that. Vertical, we talk about a lot, and that clearly is an issue, but part of fixing the vertical is fixing the horizontal.
Right, but we should not be putting up just more barriers. Our whole goal is to take down the barriers, and this is a huge issue.
It is.
One more brief comment. I agree with Janelle 100%. But honestly, I think we should defer to the legislature on this issue, because whatever we do is probably going to be not right. I'm sorry, but I've learned a lot. Yeah, if they were smart, they'd let us take the heat for it, but that's a whole different issue. My concern now is not necessarily what they're doing or not doing. I'm simply saying is that I think that once there becomes enough pressure placed on the legislature, then they may fix this problem. But anything that we do, I think we should talk about it. I think we should vet it, because whether we're going to solve it, we're not. But it is a consistent item that came up every single meeting we had across this state with community colleges, their inability for their students to transfer to four-year institutions. In my opinion, it's probably the number one thing that we heard all year long. And they want us to fix it. They look for our board to try to fix it, and I don't think we can. The other thing I do want to say this, is that I do think nursing education in Texas, I agree with you, Janelle, but by and large, it's better than a lot of places, because at least we got articulation agreements where we can go from an ADN nurse to be a BSN. There's still some barriers, but in local areas, for instance, in Panola College, working with SFA, with UT Tyler, we can articulate those ADNs pretty well with the BSNs, and with certain local regions of the state. It's when you go across the state where you really have some issues. So there is some good work being done. Thank you.
David, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that before we would ask the legislature's opinion on this, I think we need to do our due diligence, and staff needs to continue to explore, is there an example out there of a state or a institution or a system that's adopted a standard nomenclature, and at what cost and at what benefit? I believe you're talking about literally hundreds of millions of dollars of benefit. And I think it's going to be in individual cases where a student is able to streamline that and complete. So there's going to be a lot of stories to tell, but also a course is a course. And yeah, your course doesn't have my rigor, but my student in my course is a better student than your student in your course and knows more about the subject. It's up to the student to learn the subject matter despite the rigor of the course. And so I think part of the problem is that the community college may not be as attractive to the top tier students, and therefore those students who are not top tier are completing their associate's degree and then moving on. But that doesn't mean that we have to put a barrier up there for them to be successful. The student who is not top tier needs to be successful if we're going to achieve our 68% who have higher education in the future. So we need to. You brought up the issue of demographics. Demographics, to me, is a strategic domain that goes across all of the core values of the WAVE, and it hits workforce, it hits excellence, it hits value, it hits alignment. And so you can't take it out of any of those, because it is what it is, and I don't think it should be a separate core value. I think demographics are demographics, and whether they're changing or we're trying to be more attractive to a certain ethnic group or a certain gender, we should be attractive to all ethnic groups, all genders, and not all are alike, and all need maybe a nuanced plan of how to be successful for them.
Along those lines, I'm going to let you know about one study that we're doing with the tuning process, where we have somebody who is looking at the first, like Calculus 1, and then looking at subsequent courses. So how did they do if they took Calculus 1 at your institution, at the local community college, or at another four-year institution? Then how did they do in Calculus 2 when they moved on to that Calculus 2? And we don't have the results yet back, but we are looking at that with the tuning process to try and address the rigor question.
Yeah. But one important aspect of that is it's not just looking at the transfer, but how is everyone in the class doing? So if
compared to their other,
the transfer students aren't doing well, but are the other students doing well also? So, so we've only had the student grade data for, I guess, a year and a half now, and so as we go forward, we'll have more of that. And so this was intended as a feedback loop to our voluntary transfer compact, so we could address these issues and provide feedback to the participating institutions in terms of how students were actually doing. So it would be just not anecdotal, but real data. Okay, if we turn to the last aspect, excellence, you know that we had some real issues with this in terms of closing the gaps, and so that they asked something not surprising when you hear it, but something we definitely did not do, but maybe we ought to ask faculty how best to define excellence in their programs. We are doing that to some extent through the tuning process. I think there are a lot of things we're learning through the tuning process that we probably need to see how we can expand to all programs. Aside from the voluntary transfer projects, you may not remember that part of the tuning is looking at the outcomes for the programs and talking to faculty in the programs and industry where they would be hired in terms of what are the characteristics of the students you need and to see how those are aligned. And with the programs we've done so far, that's been very helpful. We've gotten actually thousands of responses from across the state for programs, and so that's being fed back in, and it may be that that's a way to get this loop going forward to understand this better. Institutions are having to do some things like this for accreditation purposes, so there's some value to them. We need to make sure we extend to them the results of these things so they can use that through their own accreditation process. But there are a number of things. People ask how the program approval process may hinder entrepreneurial and innovative programs. So some of these really get more at how we do our work, and I think there are things we should consider and look at. I don't know that there would be directly things in closing the in the next closing the gaps, but I think part of what came out of this was it's almost like the feedback from the regional meetings. Here are things that people are learning and working at their institutions that are a reflection of the state's needs, but also maybe how we need to work better with them. So that really concludes, and we have much more detailed notes if you'd like to see them, but these are really sort of pulling together similar remarks from different groups.
And the enthusiasm and the participation, I mean, it seems like there was a lot of obviously interest, but I mean that they were really felt that we were giving a forum to really pull back information to be able to utilize.
That was my sense,
Okay.
and I've heard that from a number of people. You know, Susan and I have worked with these conferences since the very first one.
Right.
We did the very first one, and my sense was there was more enthusiasm in participants at this one than any I recall in the past. They seemed to feel more ownership, and I'm not quite sure why. We need to figure that out, but I thought it was very productive. Frankly, our discussion groups at the end, at least in the one I was in, they didn't really want to end to go into the next meeting. So that's not usually the case with those types of meetings, as you know. And we really had much more holding power for this conference than typical. Usually at the last couple hours, you've lost maybe a third of your people. And we lost a few, but not very many. It was very small, and there were a lot of people lingering afterwards talking to each other, and as you'd walk by, you would hear they were actually, in many cases, talking about things, continuation of discussions they were having during the meeting. So I think that was positive. I hope we can maintain that, and it will be particularly important if next year we can have that as we're developing, finalizing the plan.
Dave?
Yeah, so I got to participate this year, at least in a portion of that. And this is my third year, and I think the word participatory would be the word that I would use on this one in comparison. The one thing that I think that was different, that was improvement, was the agenda was set so that the training for the trustees was the front end, and everything else was the stuff that everybody wanted to participate in. And the other is that you're really having a stakeholder process. There was an open forum for a free flow of ideas, and I think that's how we get to alignment of our goals on this with the end users, which are actually the educators. And I think that anything we can do to facilitate more participation by the attendees is going to be a step in the right direction. But I thought there was a considerable amount of enthusiasm and great participation on their part. The one thing that I do agree with the 5-year increments on the 15-year plan, and I might even add that I would call that the, quote, scheduled maintenance, because what you're doing is you're taking the car into the shop and taking a look at it, maybe trade out a few new parts for the old parts, draining the oil, looking at the crankcase and saying, okay, this car's ready to run the way it is for 5 more years, or no, we need to trade it in. The other is looking at specifically, and we can talk about this more tomorrow, what role do accrediting bodies play and what impediment do they form, especially as we look at innovation and entrepreneurship? My feeling is that accrediting bodies are important, but are they an impediment to moving forward to achieving our goals as a state and where we need to be in the next 15 years? And I just throw that out because I don't know enough about these institutional accrediting bodies in this field. I know about them in my field.
And I think that guilty is charged. And so I would imagine it probably is similar, that they are really an impediment to innovation.
I can tell you that I think both your statements are correct. I think they're important, but they can. Part of what they do is try to sustain a certain model. And I know that we're going through some issues with competency-based education. We think they're going to be resolved, but that's an issue that the entire country is facing, and the different regional accrediting bodies are handling it differently. For example, we're hoping that we'll get the final go-ahead for the South Texas College A&M Commerce program, competency-based program, in the next week or two. But we've been going through a different number of variations, and they are working with us, but it's a different model. And but I think they're learning, but it is, if you want it to turn around quickly, that's not happening.
Any other discussion or questions from David? Nope. Harold?
I just want to make certain I just want to make certain that as this information comes about, make sure that all the board members are informed that they have the information. And although we all know how you did the staff did a great job with the Leadership Council, I just want to make sure that you know that the board knows that you did a fantastic job, and the turnout was a result of the hard work of the staff, and I very much appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and a lot of staff did work, and of course, Mary always provides a key leadership aspect to that. She's relentless, and you need to be relentless on this. So I thank you, and the commissioner recommended
when you
Paul
see her
Tuff,
coming
which is a very
towards
good
you,
addition.
beaming and smiling, you need to go the other direction.
You're about to be roped into something.
I thought the new word was persistent.
Yes, persistency. Yeah, and you obviously know Mary well now.
Yeah. All right.
Down.
Moving on, let's go to agenda item 5C, which is an update on Rand Community College's baccalaureate study and addressing the state's projected workforce needs for training and education. Gary Johnstone, Deputy Assistant Commissioner, Planning and Accountability, will be providing an update on this project. Gary?
Thank you. A lot of this information is in the agenda item, but I wanted to go over it. In the 83rd legislature, there was 2 bills passed which required the coordinating board to conduct studies that related to workforce needs of the state and the supply of graduates for that workforce needs. House Senate Bill 414 we've labeled it the Community College Baccalaureate Study, and then HB 1296, which is a 5-year projection of state workforce needs, and also some additional information that we will be working with Texas Education Agency and the Texas Workforce Commission to make sure that information is disseminated to the appropriate counselors and advisors in the state. The people that are involved in these studies, as I said, the TEA, Texas Workforce Commission, and the coordinating board, the Academic Planning and Policy Division, is leading the studies. We also are bringing in staff from the RAND Corporation to assist us with these studies. They have a staff that has experience in looking at state workforce needs and anticipating appropriate education levels to meet those needs. We'll also be involving all the college presidents and chancellors. They've all have been informed of the study and have been asked for their participation. Other stakeholders that will be involved will include regional businesses, business leaders, and professional associations across the state. The baccalaureate study has a short timeline, and we needed the workforce needs, so these 2 studies are being combined into one project. The purpose of the goal of the workforce study for the Community College Baccalaureate is to analyze the needs for community college baccalaureate in the state, both in nursing and applied sciences. and also to develop a model for the coordinating board to use to analyze which fields there are needs for baccalaureates to be delivered at the community colleges and which community colleges would be the appropriate college to provide those needs. The timeline for this study, the community college baccalaureate study is due to the report is due to legislature August 1st, 2014. We have scheduled 2 webinars. We've conducted one on November 19th to explain the study to the education community, and the second one will be in March of 2014 to give preliminary results of the study to the community. At your board meeting in January, we will have representatives from the RAND Corporation here to give you an update and to outline how they'll be participating in this study. We will have a briefing of the preliminary findings for the board at the April board meeting is our plan at the moment, and we're planning to release a draft report either in late March or early April to the education community for their comments. And then we will be bringing the draft report back to this committee in June, and be presenting that report to the board in July for approval so that we meet that August 1st deadline. The workforce study, which is the purpose of that is to analyze the workforce needs and make a projection, a 5-year projection of the demand and supply of the workforce and what level of education is required for those jobs. And based on those recommendations, then, or based on the analysis, the board will be working to make recommendations on expanding existing programs or developing new programs to meet the demand in the workforce. The timeline for this second study follows the first one until we get through April, and then since this study will be more in-depth analysis, we will be working on a draft report to be released in October of 2014, and then bringing back the comments that we received on that report back to this committee in December of 2014 for January board approval in 2015, which will meet the legislative deadline of February 1st, 2015. Be glad to address any of those or answer any questions.
David? Gary, the webinar on November 19th, was that advertised to the board? Was the board invited to participate in that? I don't recall that. It's not a trick question.
I know we sent it out to all the chancellors and presidents and of the colleges. I don't believe we sent it to the board. I think it was mainly for institutional input and to let them know that we were even doing this study, because at that point they didn't even know we were doing it.
Right, and is that recorded somewhere where I, as a board member, could go view that?
Under the agency information, under past events, there is a YouTube video of the meeting, and there's also the presentation materials that were provided for that meeting.
And can staff please maybe send us a link to that on an email, if you would not mind? I'd like to review that, and could we possibly be invited to the one in February, even if we can't participate?
Yes, sir.
A link to that, because I would imagine that you're probably doing it during the duty day, during business hours, and that's usually not good for a lot of us. But I would like to at least visualize it.
Bill, you may want to address that.
Uh-oh. Oops. Maybe I don't want to see it.
No, I admire your willingness to participate. It could involve certain logistical problems in terms of it being considered a meeting at which a quorum of the board may attend, and so we'd get into an Open Meetings Act situation that we would need to address. The other potential problem it raises is the video conferencing issue that, as you're all well aware, the legislature this session has allowed agencies to video conference on a more lenient basis so long as it has appropriate equipment. I was advised yesterday afternoon that DIR has just published draft rules and regulations concerning that, basically giving guidance to agencies. I have not yet had an opportunity to review those rules. Sid Hodgson, our Assistant Commissioner in charge of IT, is the person charged with responsibility in that area. I'll check with him, but I just want you all to be aware that it does raise both the Open Meetings Act and the video conferencing issues.
Well, maybe the more appropriate way to handle it is don't invite us to participate, but at least show us the recorded responses and the presentations so that we individually can look at those.
Absolutely, no problem at all with that.
That works. That works for
that works for me.
Yeah.
Okay,
Take away all those hurdles.
we can do that.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you. Move to item 5D, which is results of the Gentex campaign evaluation analytic data analysis. Dr. Jarrell Booker, Senior Director, Educator Quality and Special Programs, Division of P16 Initiatives. Dr. Ginger Gossman, Senior Research Specialist, Division of Planning and Accountability. And Eric Booth of the Gibson Consulting Group, Incorporated, as the evaluators will be giving a presentation, or maybe just one. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share these data with you. In my previous role as a senior research specialist, I often helped out with the evaluation side of the house, and so that is where these data are coming from. This evaluation was in collaboration with Gibson. In fact, Gibson really did the work, and we are sharing their results. This is of the entire Gentex campaign, but a lot of the data presented now will be analytic data from the main website, and that main website was launched in 2010. We're going to be using several data sources to share these data with you, and I'll explain those as I go through the presentation, but the three main data sources will be a survey of end users, Google Analytics, which gives us information about how the website is used, and Facebook administrative data. One of the first questions we were interested in learning about was how people are getting to the Gentex site. And so you'll see in this first graph that most of the people are arriving, most of the end users are arriving to the site through direct traffic. And we think this is a good sign that the messaging, the campaign is successful because people are going directly to their browser and typing in Gentex or Generation Texas. Another large proportion of people accessing the site are getting to the site through main browsers like Google, Bing, and Yahoo. And we also think that this is a good sign because then people are Googling the actual campaign, which tells us that the marketing is relatively successful. We also have other good news in that end users are reaching gentex.org through other state-sponsored sites or other campaigns that the agency is sponsoring. And we also have students or end users reaching the site through what we believe are P16 efforts by local councils, such as ISDs and local partners, university partners who are part of P16 councils. We're also interested in learning who is using the Generation Texas website. And so the previous slide was using data from Google Analytics, and this slide is using data from the end user survey. Essentially, people signed up to log into the Generation Texas website. We accessed those emails and sent them a survey and asked them to please respond. Our response rate was about 464 people, and most of those were self-identified as students. A large proportion of people who are using our site are students, which is another good sign for us, and since that is one of our target populations for the campaign. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit more about what we learned about the student population for those who responded to the survey. Most of them were female, which aligns with enrollment as we've seen in recent data. Most of the students who are accessing Generation Texas identified as Hispanic, which is also a target, aligns with the target goals of closing the gaps. Many of the students who are accessing this site have a parent who did not go to college. And we think that this is also a sign of success because we're providing information to students who may not otherwise have access to it, at least not through a parent who's had college-going experience. And finally, one of the surprising results of our end-user survey was that a large proportion of students self-identified as being in higher education. And we weren't necessarily expecting that response or that result because the GenTech site is mainly targeted for high school students, juniors, seniors, and high school graduates who are thinking about enrolling. We want to encourage them to enroll and give them the tools to do that. So learning that a lot of them may be in college kind of surprised us, but it was a pleasant surprise. But I can talk about that later if you have any questions. Another question we were interested in learning is how people are using the actual main website. And again, we were relying on Google Analytics to learn about this. If you look at this graph, it's a lot of information. Just think of the blue as access, people who are accessing the site, and think of the purple as use. So access is the number of people going. Purple is the amount of time they're on the site. And so we're using time as a proxy for use. And it looks like the two are sort of aligned. They at least overlap, but they don't overlap as much as we thought they would. And so we're still thinking about this and what this is telling us and trying to think about ways to improve the website so that these two are better aligned. But you do see in terms of the blue ticks, there are big upsurges anytime there's a Generation Texas event, which you'll see in the, that's just tagged by my little GenTex graphic. We also relied on the end user survey to find out about whether or not the GenTex site is driving students to action, because we really want to know, is the information we're providing students changing their behavior? And so we asked them, did this encourage you to take steps towards attending college, towards completing a financial aid application, and towards completing a college application? And most of them said it influenced them either a little or a lot. And so we prefer the a lot answer, but it's still good to know that the GenTex site may have moved their needle a little bit in terms of behavior. As I mentioned earlier, we were surprised to learn that a large proportion of students who answered our survey identified as being higher education students. And so what we learned is that the way high school students are using the site and the way higher ed students are using the site vary just a little bit. And so I've listed the top five pages on the GenTex site that each group is using. And the number one for the high school students is Make It Happen. The number one for higher ed students is Way to Pay, and that is the financial aid site. So that was an interesting finding for us to think about, in that students who are already in college are still wanting to know how to find finances to finish their education. And the last data I'll present to you are about social media, because we have, the GenTex campaign was designed not just to have the main website, but to have satellite sites with each P16 council, and to launch social media such as Facebook and Twitter in conjunction with the main website to try and reach a broader audience and to make it easier for them to access this information. And so the blue here is the number of stories created, the number of stories that went up on Facebook, and that means it's a post. The orange is the number of times those posts were then shared, and then the purple is the number of times people actually opened the post. So as you may know, Facebook, there's a wide variety of the way people interact with that, and sometimes they look at things, sometimes they actually open things. And we were it was a happy discovery to learn that the largest tick was in May for all used shared, and engaged, because that's when Gentex Day happens, and that's a fairly successful part of the campaign. So we were glad to see this result in the social media findings. And to date, we have over 1,600 people who like our page. In fact, several hundred of them are new, and that was a result of the recent video contest that was hosted on Gentex. So we were happy to see an uptick in likes. But the use of social media is something we have to think about strategically, because we don't expect that the people who like our site will remain liking our site. This is not a static audience. We expect it to change as the information is no longer relevant to them. They may unlike the page so it doesn't show up in their feed.
So I just have a question on when it's on that one right there, number of stories created. What is that? Who's creating those? How does that happen?
I'd like to invite Priscilla Martinez from P16 and Eric Booth from Gibson Consulting to be by my side, so if I misspeak, they can correct me. But my understanding is the way that the Facebook Gentex site is created, administrators who are staff here can post stories, but also anyone who likes the page is then given access to post a story as well. The majority of stories posted are by staff, and
that's what I was wondering.
Content created by us.
Yeah, over 800 of them. Seems like a whole bunch, which is wonderful, and obviously it's around the Gentex Day. I was just trying to get a handle on who's doing all that.
And P16 councils can join in too.
It's a mixture of the councils and our own main Gentex Facebook page. So it's a lot of on our end, letting them know that Gentex Day is, right around the corner, or it's, what to do, getting the promotional kit out there. And then telling the councils, okay, these are the steps you can take to promote in your area. And that's when they engage their own followers. So depending on the council organizations or partners across the state, that's how those stories are told and shared.
David?
Yeah. In the Learn More, Earn More section, this may not be your expertise. We're very limited in the number of career paths that we have here. Have we made an effort to go out to the business community and to have a much broader spectrum of offerings? Because there are some incredible well-paying jobs in my area, my region, that are not even advertised here, that only require a associate's degree or some type of a certificate, clearly within that 1 to 2 year window that looks like the focus is. Who's responsible for updating this? And how do we get them to add a much more rich content in the Learn More, Earn More section?
That was originally developed through our Milkshake Media when we had that contract with them. But now that we do have a consultant that's working with us on our statewide campaign, and that is something we can take back, look at the workforce data, and we're looking back on other updates needed for the site as well that was recommended through our evaluation.
We also, in a different effort, have a website that's getting ready to go out this week, next week, hopefully, which has information by college, by degree level, the different where it ties to occupations and the average earnings coming out of those programs. And it has a 1 year, a 3 year, and a 5 year earnings on actual UI wage data, using the UI wage data that will be able to be out there for everybody to kind of look at what programs tie to what occupations or that sort of thing. And it also links with the TWC workforce, the work site that goes back and forth. So we've been working with TWC on that for a while.
Is that going to link to Gentex?
We will be having a link. We can put a link on Gentex that can send them over there and back and forth.
We just had an internal meeting about a week ago talking about how that we're at the point where we need to look at the various sites and make sure they're as coherent as possible. You saw on an earlier slide compared College Texas, where you can actually get to earnings by field for institutions, and that rolled out several months ago. We have a great deal of information. One thing that's different about Learn More, Earn More versus what we're talking about is it really talks about how you could go into, say, nursing. We talked about nursing earlier today, and at different levels of nursing education, you can earn increasing dollars. So that's part of the challenge of using that same model for some other things. But in terms of just where the market is in certain areas and what people are earning, we have the resources to make that happen very quickly.
I think our partners in the business community would be very interested. For instance, they're crying for people in oil and gas production and exploration right now who, one, have a certificate or certification, and two, can pass a drug screen. And right now they cannot find enough people who are qualified to fill those jobs. And I know I've talked to people in my business community who are completely unaware of Gen Techs, and yet they say, well, our people in Austin would be totally interested in being subject matter experts to be able to put something in there on that. It does not require a bachelor's degree for the majority of those jobs, and they're very well-paying jobs.
Well, it sounds like that should be a target for our first upgrade, our next upgrade to Learn More, Earn More, is to go in that particular area so we can follow up on that.
Any other questions or feedback, group? Great. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. All right, we'll move on to agenda item 5E, which is consideration of adopting the Commissioner's recommendation to the committee relating to proposed amendments to Chapter 13, Subchapter F, Section 13.107 of Board Rules concerning formula funding and tuition charges for repeated and excess hours of undergraduate students. Susan Brown is available to answer questions.
We already adopted that, sir.
Well, why don't you stop me?
Consent calendar.
I'm sorry. We were already on to E.
Number 6.
Go there. Actually, go ahead and turn it over to you, Dan. It'd be a good time to do that.
Yep. You'll make that announcement.
Yeah. Chairman Hahn and I have an appointment downtown, and so I'm going to excuse myself and turn the meeting over to Dr. Tesher.
Okay, and let the record reflect that we still have a quorum present. Next item will be Agenda 5E6, consideration of adopting Commissioner's recommendations to committee relating to Chapter 21, new Subchapter 10, concerning the loan repayment program for speech language pathologists and audiologists. You have supplementary material provided to you in the yellow color. Comments were received, and now we'll hear from Assistant Commissioner Dan Weaver.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Excuse me. Senate Bill 620 passed during the last session, creating a new program, a new loan repayment program for speech pathology and audiologists. These are brand new rules for this particular program. There isn't any funding particularly appropriated for the program at this point, so there's no general revenue associated, but we're expecting some donations to come in from the associations to kickstart the program next year. So we've crafted rules to start the program. We're anticipating having applications coming in the spring after the rules are adopted, selecting candidates in the summer, and then they fulfill a year's worth of service to use whatever donated funds that we might be able to collect in that time period. The comments that we received came in from the Speech Language Hearing Association, the Council of Administrators of Special Education. They were very consistent in their comments, and they primarily resided around a couple of different topic areas. Specifically, they were wanting to make clear that these were in Texas institutions, although it's inherent within the rules as they were written that they were in Texas, but we went ahead and added that to the rule. That's one of the amendments that was made. There was also an argument made to only include full-time participants. So rather than having a part-time component that had a proration award, they made a valid argument that they wanted this to be full-time participants, and we agreed with that. And the rules, as you see in the supplemental materials, reflects the fact that they are going to be full-time. They're going to be required to be full-time. And let me think if there's one other highlight I wanted to get to.
Dan, did the staff agree with that recommendation?
We did.
Okay.
There was a general request about of appointing an advisory committee. This came about during a time when we were paring back and scaling back the advisory committees that we have with the board. We certainly collaborate with the particular associations. We didn't feel that it was appropriate to have an advisory board for this particular program, primarily because of the scale is very small. If at some point in time we need to relook at that, we can certainly relook at that in the future. So we disagreed with the notion of appointing or putting forward the notion of having an advisory committee for this particular program. And let me think. Generally, those were the main changes that we made for this particular rule. I can answer any questions you might have, and Lisa Mahler from our staff is here, who is the queen of loan repayment programs, and I told her if the questions got hard quickly that she would have to come up and answer them. So ask away really, really hard questions if you want to hear from Lisa.
Okay, board members, do you have any easy questions for Dan? Okay, Janelle moves approval, and Chris is seconded. Any other comments or questions? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Next item is item 5E7. For consideration, it's the Commissioner's recommendation to the committee relating to Chapter 21, new subchapter Y, concerning the Student Loan Default Prevention and Financial Aid Literacy Pilot Program. Dan Weaver, Assistant Commissioner, will be discussing this with it. You have supplementary materials for you in the yellow color on your desk. Dan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The rules as posted were not changed. We received a comment from the Center for Public Policy Priorities, a very thoughtful and well-crafted response. The detail of the response was so detailed and so well thought out, we felt like it was more appropriate to be included in any contract that we might ultimately craft as to carry out the particular pilot program. We agreed with almost everything that they put into their comments, but the rules we felt like needed to sit above those comments, and these were more contractual, carrying out the specifics of the pilot project. So as we go from rule to starting the particular pilot project, we're going to take those comments that they provided and weave them within our contract that we may enter into with another service provider. So we didn't make any changes to the rule as it was posted, although we are going to incorporate their comments in any contract that might come about.
Board members, any questions? It's been moved by Janelle and seconded by Chris. Are there any other discussions? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Passes unanimously. The next and last item before us is 5E18, consideration of adopting the Commissioner's recommendations to the committee relating to the amendments to Chapter 22, Subchapter L, Sections 22.225-22.223 and 22.234-22.236 and 22239 and 22.241 of Board Rules concerning the Toward Excellence, Access, and Success Grant, acronym Texas Grant Program. It's a lot of twos. Supplementary material in yellow has been provided to you, and Dan Weaver will also be discussing this agenda item.
As you'll recall, we had a Texas grant rule that came before this committee in September that we ultimately pulled from the agenda because there were some issues with some of the changes that had been made as far as materiality. So we pulled those rules at that particular time, This is the second go-around on the Texas grant rules that came about as a result of SB 215, the changes that were put into place on Texas grant. So the rules are, twofold. They are essentially capturing SB 215 and making Texas grant a university-only program, or a health-related dental and general academic teaching institute program, and taking community colleges out of Texas grant over a period of time and transitioning those students into the TEOG program. And the bill also provides a pathway for TEOG recipients in the future then to get a Texas grant when they transfer to a university. So we've bifurcated these particular financial aid programs, but provided links for students to be able to go from one institution to another without losing their eligibility, provided they met the other eligibility requirements. In addition to this, we've also encapsulated the HB5 changes that have come about with regard to high school curriculum. There's specific language in HB5 for Texas grant that makes the foundation program also the eligible curriculum to be eligible for a Texas grant, so that's embedded in this also. The comments that we got back were from the University of Texas at Austin, and I want to thank them because the level of detail of these particular changes were exhaustive, and it's easy to miss things when you make so many changes. As we were laying out the priority model for the Texas grant, which passed 2 years ago, and making the changes for the foundation program and putting into play the priority deadline that passed 2 sessions ago, we had a mismatch between what the hierarchy of awarding was. So UT Austin asked, did we really intend to do what we said that we were going to do? And after we went back and looked at it, turns out we didn't intend for that to occur. So we did make some modifications based on UT Austin's comments. And these are specifically on 22.228B5 and 22.228B6. I'm sorry, 22.228C6. Essentially, this establishes the priority deadline, which is a date certain for institutions to be able to package the Texas grant, and it allows for priority model recipients to be put at the front of the line, which is the intent of the priority model, but it establishes that priority deadline as a more important operational date for the institution so that they could actually package financial aid for their students that applied on time. So the hierarchy that's delineated here, we forwarded that to the UT folks, and they concurred that, yes, this indeed was the intent of what the legislation had in mind, and we agreed with them at that point. So those were the substantive changes that came about with regard to UT Austin's comments, and then I'm happy to answer any kind of general Texas grant questions if you have any.
Any questions? Dan, the only question I have is, and I don't recall this and can't find it in the language, I thought I had reviewed this previously because it had been before us at one time, and the question I had is, what about the student who leaves high school, participates in military service, and then comes back wanting to re-enter higher education? Would they be eligible at that time? I thought there was something that nuanced that.
Well, I think your question was the student that started in higher education and then they left to join the military.
Right.
And then when they came back, would they be able to access into the Texas grant program?
That is right.
The statute, which was changed not last session, but in the 82nd session, added the military provision. So that particular comment and argument, whether it's valid, it's not in statute that way. The statute is very clearly trying to identify the student that graduated from high school, went into the military, and then returned. They wanted to make sure they captured that student to get a Texas grant. Your point, though, is going to require statutory change. And I think that's something that we could certainly look at as far as potential bills that could be introduced.
So the student that entered higher education and then became a military service member, completed service, and came back would not be eligible under the current statute.
Unless they've met the other requirements for any other student. There's no special provision for that particular military service person. That would have to be a statutory change, and I think there probably would be support for that.
Hear a motion? Moved by Chris, seconded by Janelle. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Board members, any other business? Hearing none, we'll stand adjourned.